Okay, what we're going to go over today is the Photoshop, and you guys should have watched the introduction kind of composition video so that you have some kind of semblance of the process in which we're going to do. And mainly what I'm going to focus on today are the layers and the adjustment layers. If you go into the Blackboard site, I uploaded this image as a Photoshop file that you can download and open that up. I'll give you a minute or two to download that and then open this up. That way we can all work on the same image, and so you can see exactly in yours what I'm talking about as we discuss these things. There we go. Okay. So this is an image, and basically what we're going to talk about today are layers, how to organize the layers, what do we do with the outputs that we get from the renderings, and then how can we start to add these pieces. And then I'm going to have you watch a few videos from other folks that are already uploaded this week that talk about adding people and trees and other sorts of things to these renderings. I'm going to turn off basically everything. Actually, I'll turn those on. So this is basically the image that we get if you just turn on the beauty layer up at the top. You turn on and off the layers by clicking on or off this eyeball here. And so this is the rendering that came out of my image when I rendered it. So this is what they call the beauty image. It has the background and the sky and everything. And what I'm going to do is kind of show you how to adjust it so that we end up with an image like this, and we do that through using some of those other layers and the essential kind of rendering essential. So if we go to these image layers and we're looking at these, the reflectance and transmission, indirect lighting, and that sort of thing. All of those will help develop. Okay, and then we also will then adjust these layers by making minute adjustments in terms of the color balance and color fills and that sort of thing as well. Does everyone have that loaded and open? Downloaded and open? Okay, I'm going to assume yes. Great. Okay. So when we download, if you recall from the 3D Max, if we went in and we selected these Corona Essential rendering layers, and what that does is each one of those break up the scene into particularly different types of information. So when we look at the direct, mine is named direct. It should be C Essential Direct. I just renamed it something different. This is all of the light that is directly hitting in the first bounce, that first direct light. Okay, so that's the first hit of all of the lights in the scene. Okay, the reflectivity shows what are, I'm going to switch all of these just for a minute. I'm going to select all of them. Have to be turned on. So that one's on normal. I'm going to switch this to normal so you can see. So here are all of the reflections. So this is the first image here that shows all of the reflections that are in the scene. And you can see barely, it's probably better on your screen, but there is a little bit of light here in these sorts of pieces. I'm going to switch this back. So what I'm doing here, when I switch this, this here tells us how we want to composite the layer. So what kind of functionality that we want this layer to have. And what that means is we can do certain things with how we composite this layer. So what we're going to generally do is use linear dodge add. And what that does is it keeps adding this color information, so the lightness, darkness, and color information on top of one another in a linear fashion. If I switch this to, let's say, exclusion or difference, you'll see that it changes how, or soft light, overlay, each one of these has a different kind of way of overlaying the information and compositing these different pieces. So generally what you're going to use are linear dodge, screen, and multiply. And those are the kind of basic ones that you'll use for the most part. Sometimes it takes a little bit of kind of testing, just trying out the different types of overlays to make sure that you find one that fits the image. Because you can start off, what I'm going to show you is kind of the basics, but when you really are trying to create your own look and a special look or something like that, it takes sometimes a little bit of experimentation to see which one looks better for you and what you want to do. So there's I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a domain of right answers. So and the right answer is really what looks best and what you're trying to achieve. What we're going to give you is kind of some formulas that seem to work. Okay, so here's the reflection. I'm going to put that back on linear dodge. Let's see. Here is the translucence. So I'm going to put this back up to normal so you can see what that is. And you'll notice that, so here is one of these instances in which I switched this opacity to 59%. So I actually turned down the opacity because I didn't like the way it was completely looking. Turn these on so you can see what I was doing. So when I added this piece to it, it was making it too bright, and so what I decided to do was turn this down a little bit to get that, allow for that translucence, but not make it such a big deal, because I thought it was a little bit too bright. So we made, if you remember in the material, we made these blades of grass and the leaves and that a little bit translucent, so that when the light shined through it, it changed the color a little bit and made it a little bit more saturated. So that's what you're seeing here when we turn this on and off. Okay. Now the refraction, if you remember, we used a lot of thin glass. So we turned off the refraction on most of the glass, all of it really. So this is really not necessarily essential. There's really no information in here. That's why if I turn this on or off, you're not seeing any sort of real information. If I switch this to normal, you see that there's very little information in here. So essentially, this is not doing anything for us. But if we add this to the linear dodge, it's also not hurting us. So it's basically, we could do without this one right now. And if you're doing exterior scenes, then you're most likely not going to have to use this rendering piece. If you do interior scenes where you're going to have like glass objects and stuff like that, where you will use refraction, and refraction is the bending of light through objects, then you will need this, and you can use that to adjust. Okay, so here is the indirect light. So that first one was all of the direct light hits, and now this is all of the bouncing light. So that's adding all of the light that's bouncing around. I'll just turn this to normal so you can see what this actually looks like. So you can see that all of the kind of bounce light is really happening in these areas here. When we switch that back to linear dodge add, you can see what it's doing for us. The whole scene is kind of brightening up a little bit. And then we'll go to the emission. And again, emission is one of these things in which in this particular scene we don't really have a whole lot of it, if any, because we don't really have emissive surfaces. So emissive means that things that glow themselves. So we really don't have any of those pieces, but it doesn't hurt us to have that rendered out and chosen as a linear dodge add, because it's not hurting, or it changes a little bit up along this kind of edge, this fringe edge, but I'm not too sold on whether that looks great or not. And that's where I started to look at, should I choose lighten or a different kind of layer here? Because linear dodge add, for me, it started to make this thing kind of look fringy and strange. And so that's where I started to experiment. Is screen better? Does that make it look better? Does lighten look a little bit better? And you just kind of test back and forth. Lighten doesn't really do anything. And then we can also play around with, oh, should we turn this down in terms of opacity? Does that help us out a little bit? It's a little better. And it's always good to zoom in and zoom out to kind of see. That's all right. Okay. So that's our image layers. That's what makes up this image. So once we get to this point, this is the kind of basics. Now you'll notice that I grouped them into these different kind of folders. And the way you do that is just by clicking this create a new group, and then you can rename it. So that's down at this folder icon down at the bottom here. And then you can just type and the way that you can move things in it is you can just grab and hold down the shift key and you can select all these things, and then we can just drag it until the whole layer kind of has an outline around it, and then you can just drop it, and now it's in this test group. The other thing we can do is move these things around so we can change the order. So if I wanted the indirect light to be right next to my indirect light, I could start to move these things around and reorder them. Now pay attention though to the order, because when you start to add and deal with different kind of opacities and different layer compositing effects, these blending modes, they matter in terms of which ones come first. So you want to make sure that that you pay attention to that, because you can't just reorder them kind of in logical fashion, because they are actually kind of built up so that one builds off of the other. For instance, so let me turn back on this group, and if I turn on my adjustment layers, you can see it's a pretty big change. But if I click and drag this group underneath, you'll see that it doesn't do anything except for to the sky, because the sky is below it, but it didn't do anything to the building because it's underneath that group. So that's why the adjustment layers are in this order here. So from top to bottom, and that's why if I turn this one on, it will basically cover over everything. Okay, so layers, moving them around, and pay attention to the order, because that's important. thing to get to. All right, so let's look at the adjustment layers and how we work with adjustment layers. I'm going to turn these all off for the moment so you can see where we're at. That's kind of our baseline group. Now our adjustment layers are down here in the bottom. So if you look at this new fill or adjustment layer, which is this kind of yin-yang or kind of circle with half black, half white. If you click on that, it brings up a whole selection of different types of adjustment layers. So this will create a solid color pattern or a gradient, so that will fill a whole layer with a pattern or a color, which we'll use in just a moment. Brightness and contrast allows us to adjust the brightness and contrast. The levels is another way of adjusting brightness and contrast, but it looks at how we map the image white and black in the image to how we want to adjust it. So we could say we want to take everything that's pure white in this image and move it to be like 50% gray. We can adjust that so that we can adjust the tonality. So let me turn that off here for a second. So this is a levels adjustment. And if we double click on this adjustment layer, it brings up this image. This is what's called a histogram. So if you ever hear what that is, if you guys are into digital photography, you should be familiar with a histogram. What this is a mapping of the amount of pixels that represent from black to white in this whole kind of image. So you can see that we have a preponderance of kind of dark information. We have very little white information. And so this was originally set over here. And what I did was I wanted to make the whites pop a little bit more. So I just dragged this thing over here and to a point where it starts to make some sense. Let me turn on the layer so you can see what I'm doing. So you can see how it's adjusting and changing that white point. And then I can also adjust the gray point. So what is mapped as 50% gray, I can adjust that here as well. And then the same thing with black. So the idea is that you want to have a full range of black to white for the most part. Maybe you won't have full on white, but generally you want to have this kind of mapped within this kind of full spectrum range. So that's what levels do. Curves are another thing. We have a curves here, and basically what that does is allows you, so levels was linear in terms of black and white. Curves allows us to adjust that mapping and curve it so we can adjust how that transition happens in terms of this piece. So you'll see here that I have kind of 3 additional adjustment points, and here's the straight linear line that we have from the histogram. And what I'm doing here is I've just selected these little parts and pieces. Let me turn that on so you can see what I'm doing. And I can adjust how it transitions. And so generally what you want to do is use kind of subtle adjustments, usually tweaking this mid-range a little bit to enhance some contrast. So we can deepen some contrast here without losing the whites. We can kind of map these things and kind of darken some things there. So it's another way of working. Then we have the black and white filter. So if we wanted to turn this thing into a black and white image, we could do that. And then we have some adjustments in terms of how we want to handle different colors. And these are filters that relate to photographic filters. So if I used, let's say, a red filter, you'll see that the reds become lighter, and the opposite colors like blue and that and the skies become kind of darker. Same thing with blue filter. You see the sky becomes much lighter. So those are some options there that you can mess around with. I'm just dragging and dropping into the trash to get rid of those layers that I don't want. So exposure is another one that we can mess around with, and what that does is basically like exposure in your camera. You can adjust that exposure and develop that to figure out how you want this to look, and you can adjust this piece. And then we get into some things like that deal with color. So all of these were just kind of looking at overall kind of brightness and contrast and the dynamic range of the image. This starts to get into the color information. So vibrance is a fairly new one in which you can start to adjust how vibrant the image is. You can see how by turning this down it becomes more muted. If I turn it up it becomes super saturated. It's not quite saturation, it's a more interesting mix. So here is super saturated, no saturation. So you can adjust the colors this way. Let's see, hue and saturation. This one is often used because we can shift the color tonality of the image pretty radically if we want to. We can also adjust the saturation here, and we can also adjust the lightness and darkness of the image. Some other cool things we can do are we can colorize it. So we can click on this colorize and you can adjust these things to create more monotone color images. And there are some presets here to adjust that you can play with. Let's see, what else did we... So color balance is probably one that you're going to use really quite often, and we'll see. In fact, I'll just turn this one off, and we'll turn on our color balance here, so you can see what we're doing. So this color balance, you can see the shift that it takes by turning that on and off. And what I was able to do on this color balance was to, if I click on this little button there, it pops up. And you'll see that there's a tone. So there's shadows, highlights, and midtones. And we can adjust the colors of each of those kind of range of things. So you'll see here, if I go to shadows, I've made them just a tad to the red, and I've added some green tonality. So you can see how this changes if I'm kind of adjusting this thing. Generally, subtle, small changes are generally best. So the midtones, I've done the same thing. So this one I wanted the midtones to be warmer, so you're seeing that I went to much more red and shifted to yellows in the midtones. And then in the highlights I did the same thing. I just pushed them all to more warm colors because I wanted a little bit more warm. And then the shadows, generally I tend to the greens and the blues to make them a little bit more cooler. So by turning those on and off, you can see how it dramatically shifts the kind of tone and range of the image to something that's a little bit more what I think is a little bit more kind of welcoming and comforting. So if you're kind of coming in here, it has this kind of really warm feeling where the light is, but yet we have some of these nice pinks and purples from the sunset starting to bleed into the colors here on the rest of the image. So I think it has a much more kind of evening kind of feel to it. So that's the way that we start to set these up. So now, generally what I try to work for is you have to work through these things several times. So I generally start with a color balance, get it roughed out the way I want, adjust the levels and curves to get the contrasts and kind of pop those things. And then the last step is I create a colored fill. So the way I did this is you go here, create solid color, and I'm very specific that I want to use 50% gray. So I'm just going to go here and say 50% gray, or if I move over into this RGB tone, so we can go 0, 0, 50. That'll give us 50% gray, 128, 128, 128. And what that does is it allows us to use a little trick. So the next thing I want to do is to rasterize the layer. So I just right-clicked over here. And it will say rasterize layer. Because that becomes kind of a smart object. I could go back and adjust the color if I wanted to. But I want to just be able to paint on this. So that's why I rasterized it. And you'll notice here that this is what I'm doing. And you'll see that that I'm switching it to overlay. Because in overlay, 50% gray comes out mapping 0, 0. So everything that's above 50% gray will make the image darker or lighter, and everything below 50% gray toward the black will make things darker. And the reason I do that is that I want to start to vignette the image, so you can see along this edge that I'm kind of darkening this edge, leaving this edge kind of light, and part of that is to kind of draw the eye in so that when it gets to this area it starts to create focus in this area here, so it kind of buffers this and frames this image. And the way we do that is very simple. We talked about dodge and burn yesterday. So that's where we use this dodge and burn tool. So we can click that. And then we can adjust the size. So we want to make sure that we're on this kind of bigger, soft, rounded, so that it's kind of fading out to the edge. We don't really want hard edges. I want to turn down the exposure quite a bit, down to around 9%. Now if you use your bracket keys, which are right next to the P, so the P key, there's those brackets, we can, the left bracket makes it smaller, the right bracket makes it bigger, so if you use those you can manually kind of adjust the size of this thing. Generally the way I work is pretty big first and then a little bit smaller. And then all we have to do here is start to paint. So I'm just clicking and painting on this image. And I'm building up in layers. So you can start to see how we're building that up real, kind of softly. And then then we can also adjust the highlights. So let's switch to dodge. And let's say I want to make this, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. So in the same layer, I can kind of come in here and lighten up these kind of areas maybe. So now if we turn off these things and I switch this to normal, you can see where we're just painting with white and dark. So we're adding darkness where we want and we're adding lightness where we want. And when we switch this to overlay, it allows us to map that light and dark areas to kind of tweak our image to make it exactly the way we want it to look. So this is where kind of the art of being able to create dynamics starts to come in. So I like to think about it as painting in shadow and painting in light, and emphasizing certain areas and using it to frame the image and start to set up the composition. So those are the basic kind of tools that you want to look at using, and putting that together in your first image as we start to composite these things. Similar things can be done in terms of if you didn't render out these different render elements that we had set up here, and we just use the beauty copy, you can do very similar things. I'm just going to move these adjustment layers on top of that image. But we might want to be doing different types of adjustments. So let me make a copy. I'm going to come up here to this corner and click Duplicate Group. So what we can do now is look at these different kind of color balance. I'm going to look at the levels and things like that first and adjust these, so you can see how it's a very different kind of scheme in terms of light and dark. So I would want to kind of push this and emphasize this, move this gray point over. Maybe I don't want the light part to be too crazy. And then I'll adjust the curves a little bit. And generally the way I work is I just experiment. I just grab and start to move around a little bit until I start to see something that I like. Okay. So I'm going to move this into my adjustment layer and then drag it down so that I can turn it all off and on at one time. So we can kind of compare the two images. So this is the singular image, and this is the composited image. And you'll see the difference is that we're able to, because we can adjust each of those elements separately, we can get a much kind of greater dynamic range and contrast. And that's why it's good to kind of start with that. Now, I might be able to get closer if I spent a little bit more time working on these adjustment layers and tweaking them a little bit, and really, try to emphasize these things and put them together in a little bit different way. But by rendering out these different render elements that come out, these different pieces, we can really adjust them and adjust each one of these things to a much greater degree. Okay, so that's what I want to cover today. You now have this file that you can test and play with. And so what I would like you to do to turn in on Wednesday is to go through and make your own set of adjustments and your own paintings using this image, using this as a starting base. Go back and adjust these different things and create a different kind of range of colors and contrasts and different ways of emphasizing the light using the this kind of overlay light and dark mapping. So just go through and then create one of these and then save it as a PNG file, and we'll turn that in for Wednesday. And then I want to start on your image, your rendering image, to develop your own version of this composition. And then I will also want you to watch a couple of videos.